Hello, everyone. This is Khayerunisaa Abbas, and I'm here with Samie and Al-Achrafi for Ask Me Anything. We're going to be exploring the future of leadership and hashtag Time for Humanity. This time, we're zooming in on how to future-proof your organizational culture. So, Samie, welcome. And what intentions do you have for us today?
Thank you, Khayerunisaa. Intentions for part 2, I think take action. So when it comes to our humanity, step 1 is, the awareness, and step 2, which lends itself to part 2, is take action.
So we have a question from a place where I'm very familiar with, which is Kenya. We have Stella Nyaga from Kenya asking, how can we measure and manage our culture following a merger?
Wow, this is a huge topic. So I will try to do justice to Stella's question. You remember when I moved to Oman for a couple of years, it was to manage the cultural integration of a bank that was 5 branches that unusually had merged with a bank of 90 branches. And the bank spoke different national languages. It was a real challenge. And one of the key learnings that I found on that change journey was there are so many stakeholders that we need to find a way to bring in the measurement of ESG as well, but how people are experiencing the change journey and at what stage you're going to bring in those measurements, because you can't measure everything at the same time. We realized usually when there's an integration or a change event, we're refreshing or re-energizing values, there's usually something that looks like a learning intervention, and that could be a one-day all-staff experience, for example. We found that the time of deploying that had to be just right. Things in the discovery or sensing stage were required to really get into deep listening, to have Edgar Schein talks about humble inquiry and engaging all the different stakeholder groups in order to identify what is the current culture and then what would the future or target culture look like. And then from that space, you'll be able to look at what are the measurements in order to manage the progression. We decided that we would have a representative from every single stakeholder group on this values and cultural integration committee. It would have been much, much easier just for the learning or business teams to go ahead and deploy. But having those representative groups was so powerful because it made people feel seen and heard, but we were able to go to the problem that was sitting underneath the problem, which going slow there helped us to go fast later on. It does require us to kind of escape this short-termism, this catching of our tail and busyness that we see in companies. I talk in the book about the different levels of thinking. When you're thinking about approaching the different phases to an integration or a merger, it's going to be important for the conscious leaders to find ways to escape that short-termism, collapse into deeper listening, and think 3, 5, 7 years from now. Stakeholders will understand, they'll appreciate that they've been engaged. It's just, as we said in part 1, what are the terms of communication and engagement? How do you communicate? And people will understand and follow you on the change journey.
Oh, I love that a lot. So it's not about what you communicate, it's how you communicate that will really make a difference. I see that.
Absolutely. When you think about the different categorization models, frameworks usually precede data. And what I found on my journey is in sense-making models, which is culture, the data often precedes the frameworks, and yet humans in business have a bias towards framework and data. Not everything can be measured. So what I found is where you are able to put lead and lag indicators, great. There's also a space for maybe a few indicators which you keep for maybe anecdotal stuff, whilst you go about that sense making and think about the framework afterwards, so it doesn't limit, if that makes sense.
It totally does resonate with me. Thank you so much for that. Well, now we have a question for somewhere where you're very familiar with, and this is Irene Halls in the UK. And she asks, how do we incorporate purpose into decision making?
Ooh, great question. Well, I fear when we talk about purpose, some people's eyes glaze over, but purpose is so important because it connects to our humanity. I actually changed my entire career trajectory because I had written a robust report linked to my meaning and purpose in life. and it was marked sensitive and filed away, never to be seen again. And then when I changed career, we were selected in the country I was working in to deploy a new system. It was a nightmare, such a headache. And I speak on behalf of the team when I say it came at great personal expense to us all. We managed to get it across the line with an awareness that 70 plus other countries would have to follow with the launch. So we decided to invest, give ourselves more purpose and meaning by writing a lessons learned document that we would be able to share. It was sent to Center, the headquarters, again, never to be seen. So I think that if organizations are missing how to bring in the human, the people, the purpose aspect, then potentially there's a blind spot there that's playing out and you're missing on the secret sauce. Because we love frameworks, it could be quite useful, all human beings have bias, to take your decision through a process. So you'll have heard me, Khayerunisaa, talk about the 3 Ps before, of course, people, profit, planet. Maybe what you do if we all have blind spots, even the best of us, is you take your decisions through certain questions so you cover off those different aspects. Some clients we've worked with add process. For example, if there's a safety or compliance aspect to their work, or you could have performance, or why not purpose as well. But I was really interested in a piece of research I read recently. There was a study where 2,500 people were asked to analyze medical images for what they called objects of interest. They told one group that the information would be discarded, and they told the other group that they were looking for cancerous tumor cells. The workers were paid per image that was analyzed, and the meaning group, they spent more time on each image. On average, they earned 10% less than the discard group, but the quality of their work was much higher. And the insight I took from that piece of research is when you reshape employees' motives and link to purpose, it results in better decision-making and performance. And I saw on LinkedIn the other day, the CEO of First Direct Bank is now reaching out to employees that worked at the beginning of the bank in order to connect with them to bring in the purpose piece as they examine it for what their bank looks like moving forward. I love that.
I love that too. That's amazing. Leading us to the next question from Irene Halls as well is how do we ensure that whatever changes are made at the board or exco levels are actually reflected in the organizational culture, or taking into consideration the impact it's going to have on organizational culture?
Well, I think it's a great question because there's a perception which perhaps is warranted that decisions that are made at the top are disconnected from what actually happens in the rest of the company. So if you're seeking to achieve coherence and harmony, whatever changes, as Irene says at the top, need to be better reflected everywhere in the company. And that idea of decisions being made behind closed doors, the lack of vocabulary that leaders often have around values and how decisions have been made, they create voids. And where there are voids, I found question marks come and fill them, or rumors come and fill the voids. So it requires real intentionality, that word you keep hearing me say. But the problem is, we're busy. And we were just saying before, if we are too busy to collapse into the role of a coach, a facilitator, deeper listening, humble inquiry, then it's going to be very difficult for the strategic decisions to cascade throughout the organization. And I think conscious leaders are those that challenge the status quo. They're not ones who just say, this is the state of my diary. They look for ways to block time for reflection. They find ways to get out into nature where that's possible. They challenge the norms, the status quo. They have a dictionary of terms, that vocabulary around values. So they're able to have a central message and supporting messaging so people know where we are and where we need to get to. That will translate behaviorally, but it might not happen straight away. So in the TED Talk, I talk about this 1 degree shift. Even if it feels counterintuitive because we ascribe value to being busy and getting stuff done, outputs of a moment, if you take back 1 degree of control now, directionally, it will take you somewhere very different. 3, 5, 7 years down the line. So give thought to what is the 1 degree shift? What's the one thing you can do to take back control? Because in doing so, you will lead with more humanity, which will mean that you would deliver on the strategic aspirations of your business. What's your perspective with that?
Samie, for me, I think once again, I really agree what you're saying, but I also see from another perspective is getting the leaders to understand when you're sitting around a table or across from each other, what are you putting at the forefront when you're making these decisions? Agree together. How will this impact this? How will this impact that from all perspectives before asking other leaders to take that on board in terms of leading other people to align with the direction that you're going. I think that transparency, those kind of conversations, and for those sitting around the table, if you didn't understand it, to own it and say, I didn't understand how you intend for us to do this, or what impact it will have on our organizational culture, so that those conversations can prepare you to basically lead with intention when you go back to your teams.
You know, this, when I talk about energy, it's not Samie the philosopher, it's science. Energy exists, it's everything, but we just maybe don't see it. And when I think about change initiatives, another insight I've had, Khayerunisaa, is change often feels, for the executives behind closed doors who are very much engaged with it and thinking it through, it feels quite push energy. It's something to galvanize people around. It's something to push down, to get done. And yet we said in part 1, change is really difficult for most people, particularly given the amount of changes has happened because of the coronavirus and the amount of control that human beings have had to give up. And so when I think about communicating and cascading to your people, I encourage you to imagine that the energy field is visible. Are you pushing potentially a little bit too much? Imagine how people feel when they receive that energy. Do they have a knot in their stomach, or do they feel energized by it? We've all been to meetings with certain managers that we dread and we leave feeling depleted or drained. And we've all had I hope we've all had meetings with those conscious leaders who actually feed us with energy. So there's something here where if we're going to lead with our humanity and keep people's brightness, then I think it takes skill as much as commitment to make some of these things go from invisible to visible in your leadership.
How fabulously put. Thank you so much for that, Samie. I have another question, but this comes from Anonymous, and it says, I have been able to evolve my team, my team culture, but still struggle with my line manager. Do you have any advice, Samie?
Wow, well, we were just talking about it. I guess this is a $64,000 question. And the acknowledgement that we all have a boss, even the CEO has a boss. So when you think about the boss factor, it's humbling to realize the amount of impact that we have on people's well-being through those relationships. And the research tells us the relationship with a boss is by far the most important thing when it comes to job satisfaction. And yet, over 70% of people say that spending time with their boss is the most stressful part of their entire working week. And I don't know this for sure, but when I was interpreting the study, my sense was that doesn't mean the bad bosses. The boss factor is, even, for want of a better term, the good bosses are still creating stress when it comes to leading people. So there's a real opportunity here. And I think there needs to be a conversation. If you want to get something done, something changed, I've tried the approach on my journey where I've crossed my fingers and hoped that somebody else would give the feedback or the person would become enlightened overnight or on a holiday. But on Samie's journey, that's never happened. So I think
neither on mine.
Okay, well, I'm not alone then. I think there does need to be a conversation just to engage a line manager, and there's a way to do it. So for example, I would here differentiate between concern and criticism. In my mind, concern is where you're addressing a behavior. So it feels a little bit more solution focused. Whereas of course, criticism feels a little bit more subjective or personal. And you want to be seen and heard. If you address the behavior, it's more likely that you will be seen and heard. So when giving the feedback, especially to a line manager, it's a daunting task, but it's super important. What I would do is think about the context, make sure it's timely, but what's the environment? What is the medium for having that conversation? And then I would start with thank you. Try and get the buy-in early on so that they're bought in and engaged into the conversation. So, for example, I would say, thank you, whatever the name is. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me so I can share my perspective, because I do value our relationship. I think it's really important that we maintain a strong relationship. And then with that constructed framing, I would ask a question that would invoke a yes. So this is known as proceed by agreement, well known in negotiation theory. So I might say, would that be okay with you? 9 times out of 10, of course, the answer will be yes. And then I would move into what is observable. So what do I see and hear? What do I notice specifically? And then I would mention the impact that that has. And then I would end with a thank you, because if your manager has spent time having that conversation with you, I think it's well worth at the end to say, thank you for hearing me out.
Absolutely.
Thank you for seeing me. You know, often we have the conversation in our head a number of times before we have the conversation out here. And so when I go into challenging conversations, I try to remember beforehand, Samie, you've had this conversation many times. This is potentially the first time that the other person has heard it. And I always think, like you start our conversation, what is your intention? I always think to myself, what do I want the intention to be? Do I want the person to know what my perspective is? Do I want them to change? Do I want the person to be more mindful? When you go in with the energy of intention, it frames the conversation more powerfully.
True, 100% true, Samie. You know, what I've found on my own personal journey is that whenever I'm talking to someone, when you're holding that intention of not addressing the person, not judging the person, and not coming into the conversation thinking that you're better than that person, normally you would have a much better outcome, because then you're not addressing personally the person, but naming what behavior you've seen and the impact that it has, being very, very objective rather than being subjective. So I really like that insight.
Let's not go into conversations trying to fix people, because we don't want to be fixed. What we want is the opportunity to hear and then to take action on our journey. So all this data and information is useful. It doesn't mean I will apply it the same hour or the next day. Give people space, but hold us accountable as managers.
And it's respectful, right, Samie? It's the humane thing to do.
There you go.
So I'll bring you to the other question that we have. Again, it's from Anonymous, and they ask, how do we make sure our culture focuses on inclusion as well as diversity? And here I'd like to make a reference, Samie. In Time for Humanity in the book, you had a chapter talking about diversity of thought. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Because the first thing that came to my mind when you were asking the question was, what do you mean by diversity?
I knew it.
In this part of the world, often it just means gender. And because there's nationalization initiatives, often it means nationalization targets or data. But I would often ask, how far do you want to go down the rabbit hole? Because when you really get to grips with diversity, inclusion, belonging, you start to think about, well, do you hire ex-convicts? Do you have people of different abilities in frontline roles? Do you have a paid leave policy for physical and mental health issues? So it's a vast subject. But when I talk about cognitive diversity in the book, I say in the chapter, Conscious Leadership in a Global World, we're actually making humankind less resilient because we are ignoring critical levels of diversity and individuality whilst we focus on these surface level differences. You know, in the business world, we often hear about diversity of thought, but do we actually achieve that? And my suggestion is not often, because it takes work. So when you think about individual and collective resilience, we might have to sacrifice some of our efficiency to make room for these messy interactions among human beings who don't see the world in the same way. We have to make room for those contested areas which sit between and within cultures. The latest buzzword I'm noticing is we hire for culture add, not culture fit. But what does that even mean? For example, a tech firm wanted to use consultancy services, and I was having a conversation where it was brought up that my photograph on my bio was a little bit formal. Now, you know me, Khayerunisaa, I'm usually found in t-shirt, shorts and a flip-flop. So I had to
Exactly.
smile at, yeah. And the question was asked, how do you think you will work with techies? Because your voice is quite posh and you come across as quite formal. And I wanted to say, when I learned English in Abu Dhabi at the British school, my teacher used to go, whom, what, where. I should close the feedback loop all these years later and say I'm now disadvantaged because of the way that I was taught English as a second language. It's not my fault. So I think, you know, we talked about buzzwords. Be very careful when you're looking at diversity and inclusion, because culture add, I would like us to see, is around engaging people, which is messy in the diversity of thought, which includes people of differing political opinions. And we're speaking today in the Middle East, and it could be different perspectives on world global challenges. It's just that awareness in humanity. We're 8 billion people who see the world differently. That's why relationships are a challenge, but that's what makes us beautiful.
Thank you so much for that, Samie. And I hope that's answered your question. And now we're going to move on to the next question that comes from North Al-Swadi in the UAE. And North has two questions for us. The first question is, how can organizational culture be improved during these challenging times, especially in markets where the concept of organizational culture is still in an emerging state? How do you reconnect others with the system, Samie?
So my understanding of the question is, how can organizational cultures be improved when there's so many challenges going on at the moment?
Sure.
And giving thought also to emerging markets, for example, in the global south, but it could also be emerging sectors. I get it. Well, I think it's worth starting by saying 60% of people in the US and also most developed economies can't even work remotely during this time. The way that people are experiencing the pandemic is very, very different. And therefore, it's not a cop-out, but I would start by saying there's no one-size-fits-all response to this. What's coming up for me is a need to be flexible and to offer choice, but to take a step back and do a reframe. I keep hearing the sentence, we're working from home, but there's a reframe to that we're sleeping at work. And some people are loving working from home. For those able to do so, they might feel liberated. They might be enjoying the autonomy. They might have a larger garden, for example. So I think there's just that empathy and awareness of people are experiencing these challenging times very, very differently. And when we think about this part of the world, we're speaking in the Middle East, so many expatriates have not seen their family for well over a year. So we're in a challenging market environment where we're trying to recover. We're trying to drive results as the world hopefully opens up. And yet, business of business is people, and the people need that flexibility and choice. How people go back into the shared spaces of work, for example. And they're calling it re-entry anxiety. It's a real thing. You know, we think about the mind, body, and soul in our coaching work. And I can tell you, I don't want to sound like I'm overly about the body, but for me, as an asthma sufferer wearing a mask, my social intelligence has started to go down over the last year, because when I'm faced with a choice to leave the house or stay in, I kind of stay in because of the mask as well, or I'm not sure, maybe it's my diet. I've started to get lots of spots as well. You know, when you don't feel like you look good, it starts to impact the way you show up in other. And I become a little bit less resourceful. So I don't want this huge and tragic pandemic. I don't want to take it down to Samie's acne, but I just wanted to give an example of, for me, those little things make an impact.
I know that wearing a mask 8 hours a day has been very challenging for me. For me, it comes to a point where I feel I can't breathe. So you can imagine if you think about going back to work full time and not having to wear that mask for 8 hours, it can be very daunting for some.
Absolutely. And you will know when a child is born, the first thing that's needed is safety and
Yeah,
love. In an
true.
organization, it's no different. We're dealing with human beings.
Yeah.
How do you provide the physical and the psychological safety? In other words, how do you express care while driving results? And as you know, all roads lead to Rome. The answer is leading with our humanity.
True. And that's why I'm kind of an advocate of having these internal coaches, because can you imagine what the first few weeks will feel like for those who are returning to work full time, knowing what they know and carrying the fears that they carry inside of them in terms of productivity, in terms of engagement, in terms of showing up in the system, all of that needs to be addressed and needs to be supported by someone. So this I cannot emphasize the importance of having internal coaches in the organization at this particular time because of the employees' well-being.
I 100% advocate that. And something you said before, Khayerunisaa, is coming to my mind now, which is don't think that other people are seeing the world the same way as you are. So if you're looking to have that diversity and inclusion belonging, recognize everybody sees the world differently. And then from that space, how do you drive results? By leading with humanity.
Thanks, Samie. Then we have another question again, and that question was again from Nof Al-Swadi. How do we identify the influences and energizers in the company to support the cultural shift in the organization?
Ooh, great question. Well, the survey that we spoke about in part one, where you could do a diagnostic, you could do a survey to tap into perspectives, that could be quite useful to give you an insight into who responded, that they were energized by the change. So there are different methods to be able to identify the culture or values champions, the people who are energized by it. We've even in previous companies done a version of Pop Idol. It sounds hideous, so it's minus the singing, but you get the point. It's a fun way to be able to get people to showcase their connection to the actual and the aspirational values as part of a change. I've even seen organizations like Miro, which is the online collaboration platform, they call them Mironeers, and they select within the peer base, the colleagues select who the culture champion is and recognize them for a certain value. For example, there might be a pin sent to somebody for practicing empathy to gain insights. Don't underestimate how important rituals and symbolization is. You know, Emirates Airline, every single member of frontline staff wears a star, and in Arabic, star is Najum, and it means that they've gone through a program called Najum, which is part of the values and culture transformation program, where they've made a commitment to bring it to life at work. Having something visible is a great way to recognize and honor people, because when you have a values committee, there needs to be some kind of recognition and reward for them. Now, I'm not going to say, people don't want to work for free, right? So it doesn't have to be a monetary exchange, but think about what are the ways that you can get people to be recognized for leading the change and for taking a role in the system as a key influencer or a culture champion. What have you seen work, or what comes up for you?
Samie, I actually worked for a company here in Oman based out of Sohar, which is a manufacturing company that actually had these values, value badges that they would, any employee would have it on their system, and they could give it to any other employee that they saw living this value. And each time they recognized the other employee, these employees would basically have a set of badges given to them. And at the end of the month, they would be celebrated for what they do. So I was really privileged to have to live through that kind of work environment. It was really, really helpful.
Yeah, I love that. Whatever works in your national culture and for your organizational culture, but there are ways to think about recognition of total rewards, and then people will want to show up. If you think about a net promoter score, you will have advocates or promoters. they will also have a population of people who are passives. That's not a problem, but I wouldn't focus the change efforts initially on the passives. I found most people will adopt the new behaviors or ways of working if they make sense because of social norms. It feels like a very human thing to do. But don't discard the detractors. You know, people who show up as cynical, they had a dream, they care, and often over the years, or something significant happened, that dream has slightly been dimmed. There's a way to get those detractors or cynics back into the advocator role if you go through MPS. So think about who in your population you will target, but don't discard people. Just think about where you will perhaps start.
And not everybody's driven by money, so it doesn't have to be, you know, monetary recognition. It could just be the moment that you actually stop and take the time to recognize somebody for going above and beyond, or living their value, or living aligned to a value. That makes all the difference.
Yep, that's why communications need to be your best friend in any change effort, because even if an employee has a communication loop closed, where after the change initiative or the new behavior, somebody can support by closing the feedback loop to say, this is what shifted. That is so fulfilling for people to know purpose and meaning, that we are having an impact in the organization. And I guess as we bring the session to a close, I have a question for you, Khayerunisaa, to close a feedback loop. And my question is, from reading Time for Humanity, from using the hashtag in order to grow this community of like-minded people who want to show up, who are asking these big and important questions, I'd love to know what shifted for you since reading Time for Humanity.
I think, Samie, that's a very interesting question. A lot has shifted for me, but what comes to mind at the moment is evolving from the ego to ecosystem in service to the client and not to collude. I see how 1 degree shifts look like further down the line, keeping in line my life learning mindset. You understand what I mean, Samie?
Absolutely. I love what you say about colluding, because every time we partner with an organization, we start to collude with that system, but we want to do so from a space of what is, so there's no judgment. We say, everything has brought us to this moment, and then is there an opportunity for us to do things slightly different? I believe it is part of humanity to evolve. From that space, it feels very accessible. I use the word, who wants to join this adventure? And if you do, please use the hashtag Time for Humanity for any articles or any posts, because what we're finding is, instead of connecting with bad news that could frame your day, why not be part of this community of, you know, different perspectives, or filling your cup with these good news stories?
Thank you so much, Samie, for this opportunity to have this Ask Me Anything session with you, part 1 and part 2. We've come to the end of today. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone who participated to send in their questions. If you have really enjoyed these sessions, please like, share, subscribe, and press the notification bell. But please keep the questions coming in. If there's any other questions that come into mind, we're still entertaining them. So please do send us some questions. All right.
Absolutely.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, they will inform the next Ask Me Anything. So keep them coming. Thank you so much. And thanks, Khayerunisaa, for all you do and for leading with humanity. So thank you again.
Thank you. Bye, Samie.
Bye for now.